What is law? Most of us would answer, it's a system of rules created for protection, order, and justice. But what if I told you that throughout human history, the law has been not only a shield, but also a sword? That the most cruel, inhumane, and immoral acts in history were committed not in defiance of the law, but on its very authority? Today, we will open the dark side of the statute book and examine the shocking examples of how justice became a weapon and cruelty became state policy. This is the story of how evil was made legal. In ancient Sparta, the survival of the state was everything, right? Individual life just didn't hold the same weight. From the moment a child was born, they were put under the microscope to see if they had what it took to thrive in this tough, military-driven society. According to the historian Plutarch, newborns were presented to a council of elders. If they didn't make the cut, if they were weak, deformed, or sickly, they faced a grim fate. They were taken to a chasm near Mount Tagaius, known as the Apartheid, and left there to die from exposure. Can you imagine the weight of that decision? It was all about strength and survival. No room for weakness in their world. This practice, which some might call state-sanctioned infanticide, was all about making sure only the toughest and healthiest kids could grow up to boost Sparta's military strength. Can you believe that? It wasn't some secretive ritual. It was just part of everyday Spartan life. They really pushed for strength, endurance, and physical perfection. If you weren't up to snuff, you might not even get a chance to survive. It's wild to think how deeply this mentality shaped their society, right? Imagine living in a place where being strong wasn't just a good thing. It was a must. Plutarch had some wild stories, right? Like, did you know that back in the day, babies were sometimes bathed in wine instead of water? Can you believe that? It was this quirky folk practice meant to test their toughness and resilience. Only the strongest little ones made it through those early trials. If they survived, they were tossed into this super intense education system called the agoge. Picture it, a place where everything was about discipline and military readiness. Kids were pushed to their limits, learning how to fight and survive in a harsh world. They trained hard, ran marathons, and even faced off in real battles. It was brutal, but it shaped some of the toughest soldiers in history. Isn't it fascinating how different cultures approach childhood and upbringing? Just think about how these practices created a society of warriors, slave gladiators. In ancient Rome, slavery was not just accepted, but deeply woven into the fabric of society. Estimates suggest that at the height of the empire, up to 40% of the population in Roman Italy were enslaved, many of whom were prisoners of war, captured pirates, debtors, or born into servitude. Under Roman law, enslaved people were considered property, not persons. This legal classification gave their owners nearly complete authority over them. An enslaved person could be bought, sold, beaten, or even killed, though killing an enslaved person without just cause was later outlawed under Emperor Hadrian. However, such laws were rarely enforced and offered minimal protection. Gladiators, often mistaken for mere entertainers, were typically enslaved individuals trained to fight for public amusement. They were kept in special schools called ludi, where they underwent harsh physical training and strict discipline. All gladiators were legally classified under infamia, a status that stripped them of legal and social protections. Imagine a time when gladiators were not just fighters, but also people trapped in a harsh reality. They couldn't vote, hold public office, or even make legal wills. It's wild to think that even the most famous fighters, who battled their hearts out, still faced stigma. But here's a glimmer of hope. Some of these warriors could earn their freedom. After surviving countless brutal battles, they could be gifted a wooden sword called a rudis. This little piece of wood was more than just a sword. It was a powerful symbol of their emancipation from the arena. It's like going from being a mere pawn in a game to finally claiming your own life back, right? Justinian Code. The Corpus Juris Civilis, commonly known as the Justinian Code, was one of the most influential legal reforms in history. Commissioned by Emperor Justinian, the first of the Byzantine Empire, and completed by the year 534 AD, its goal was to simplify and organize centuries of complex and often conflicting Roman laws into one unified legal system. While it brought many positive legal advancements, it also codified social and political issues with a strict moral and religious tone. For example, adultery, certain homosexual acts, and heresy were not just sins but crimes punishable by severe penalties. Non-Christians were banned from holding public office, and pagan practices were outlawed as the state used the law to reinforce religious orthodoxy and political unity. The code also reinforced a rigid social hierarchy. It granted men legal dominance over women in many areas and maintained slaveholding as a legal institution. Although it did provide some avenues for manumission, the Justinian Code wasn't just a set of laws. It was the backbone of the Byzantine Empire for a whopping 900 years. Can you believe that? Later on, during the Middle Ages, it got a second wind when it was rediscovered in Western Europe, shaping a lot of modern civil law systems we see today. Sure, some parts of it were pretty harsh, like those strict penalties, but it really was a game changer. It brought clarity and structure to the law, showing how legal reform could help control, educate, and unite an entire empire. Think about it. A legal framework that not only governed, but also helped create a sense of community. How cool is that? Heresy laws. In medieval Europe, heresy was not just a spiritual matter, but a serious legal offense that could lead to arrest, torture, and death. From as early as the 11th century, people who challenged the teachings of the Catholic Church faced punishment. Back in 1022, something pretty shocking went down in Orleans, France. A group got burned alive for sharing beliefs that were considered super dangerous. Can you believe it? This was one of the first times a state actually executed people for heresy in Europe. As the fear of heresy grew, the Church began working closely with secular rulers to pass laws against it. In 1184, Pope Lucius III issued a major decree called Ad Abolendum. It established a formal process for bishops to search for heretics in their areas and hand them over to secular authorities for punishment. Those convicted could lose their property, their legal rights, or be excommunicated. In England, laws against heresy became even more intense in the 1400s. A law called De Heretico Comburendo was passed in 1401, which explicitly allowed the state to burn heretics alive. Just a few years later, the 1414 Suppression of Heresy Act gave secular courts more power to arrest suspected heretics. During the 1500s, especially under the reign of Queen Mary, the First of England, laws against heresy were revived to target Protestants. Hundreds of people were executed during this period, often by being burned at the stake. It was not until 1677 that the English Parliament passed a law ending the death penalty for heresy, though it remained a crime. These laws were designed to protect the Church's authority, but they also silenced free thought and punished people simply for holding different beliefs. Spanish Encomienda. The Encomienda system was a colonial labor structure established by the Spanish crown in the early 1500s. It granted Spanish settlers, known as encomenderas, the right to collect tribute and demand forced labor from indigenous communities in the Americas and the Philippines. In return, the encomenderas were theoretically expected to offer protection, religious instruction, and basic welfare. However, in practice, the system became a brutal tool of exploitation. Indigenous people were forced to work in dangerous mines, fields, and construction projects under extremely harsh conditions. Many died from overwork, starvation, disease, and violence. Although the Spanish crown introduced regulations like the laws of Burgos in 1512 and the new laws in 1542 to limit abuse, enforcement was weak due to the vast distances and the immense power of the colonial elite. The encomienda system eventually declined and was replaced by other exploitative models like the repartimiento and the hacienda. While it was largely phased out by the 18th century, its impact was long-lasting. It devastated indigenous populations, disrupted social systems, and laid the groundwork for continued economic inequality and racial hierarchies throughout Latin America. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, European and colonial governments passed a series of powerful laws targeting witchcraft. These statutes reflected deep-seated fears of magic, heresy, and social disruption, and they often sanctioned torture, public trial, and execution. One of the most influential texts, though not a law itself, was the 1487 book Malleus Maleficarum, which outlined how to identify, prosecute, and punish witches, legitimizing the practice for decades. In 1563, England passed the Witchcraft Act under Queen Elizabeth I, making it a felony to practice witchcraft to harm others. The law expanded in 1604 under King James I, increasing penalties and leading to a wave of trials. During the 17th century, colonial America enacted its own versions. The Massachusetts Bay Colony first made witchcraft a capital offense in 1641. Its legal framework laid the groundwork for the Salem witch trials of 1692, which resulted in the execution of 20 people after accusations rooted in social tension and mass panic. In 1735, Great Britain overhauled its approach with a new Witchcraft Act, which made it a crime to claim magical powers or to accuse others of witchcraft. Laws stopped punishing real magic and focused on fraud instead. Can you believe it? Then in 1951, the UK finally ditched those old laws with the Fraudulent Mediums Act. Transatlantic Slavery. The transatlantic slave trade, spanning from the 16th to the 19th century, was enabled and protected by a series of formal laws passed by European governments. These laws helped legalize the capture, transport, and forced labor of millions of Africans. One of the earliest legal instruments was the Asiento de Negros, a monopoly contract issued by the Spanish crown, granting a company or nation the exclusive right to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies. In 1713, Britain received the Asiento through the Treaty of Utrecht, legally allowing them to deliver 4,800 enslaved Africans per year to Spanish territories. In the colonies, laws known as slave codes were introduced. The 1661 Barbados Slave Code is one of the earliest and most influential examples. It established that enslaved people were property and had no personal rights. These laws were later adopted and adapted in other British and American colonies. By the late 18th century, public opposition grew stronger. The Slave Trade Act of 1788, also called Dolben's Act, was the first step towards reform, aiming to reduce overcrowding on slave ships. In 1807, Britain passed the abolition of the Slave Trade Act, which made it illegal to carry enslaved Africans on British ships. The Royal Navy really stepped up by creating the West Africa Squadron, right? This squadron wasn't just any patrol. It was like a dedicated force that cruised the Atlantic, actively intercepting slave ships and freeing over 150,000 Africans during its operation. Can you imagine the bravery it took? Even though slavery itself stuck around for decades after, these laws played a huge role in breaking down the legal framework that supported the trade. It's a significant step, showing how efforts like this were crucial in the fight for human rights, paving the way for future movements against slavery. Indian Removal Act. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act into law, authorizing the forced relocation of Native American tribes living east of the Mississippi River. The official policy aimed to open valuable land, particularly in the Southeast, for white settlers and cotton cultivation. The law granted the president power to negotiate land exchange treaties, often using coercion rather than fair diplomacy. Within a few years, tribes like the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole were forced to give up millions of acres of their ancestral land. The forced removal of the Cherokee in 1838 became known as the Trail of Tears. U.S. soldiers rounded up nearly 16,000 Cherokee and forced them to march over 1,000 miles. More than 4,000 people died from disease, malnutrition, or exhaustion. Despite the Supreme Court's ruling in Worcester v. Georgia, which affirmed Cherokee sovereignty, President Jackson reportedly ignored the decision, famously saying, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." His administration pushed ahead, using both political and military means to enforce removal. The Indian Removal Act caused a cultural disaster, uprooting generations of Native American communities and resettling them in unfamiliar territories. Jim Crow laws. Following the end of Reconstruction in 1877, Southern states in the United States began passing a series of racial segregation laws known as Jim Crow laws. These laws institutionalized the separation of black and white people across nearly every aspect of public life. Jim Crow laws mandated the use of separate facilities, from schools and parks to public transportation and restrooms. Although the Supreme Court's 1896 decision in Plessy v. Ferguson ruled that such segregation was constitutional under the separate but equal doctrine, the facilities and services provided to black people were consistently and deliberately inferior. These laws also imposed severe barriers to political participation. Mechanisms like literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses were introduced to disenfranchise black voters. In Louisiana, for example, black voter registration plummeted from over 130,000 in 1896 to just 1,342 by 1904. A Jim Crow system began to unravel in the mid-20th century, starting with the 1954 Supreme Court ruling in Brown v. Board of Education, which declared segregation in public schools unconstitutional. This was followed by the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which formally dismantled legal segregation and protected voting rights. Nuremberg Laws. In 1935, the Nazi regime in Germany introduced the Nuremberg Laws, which stripped Jews and other targeted groups of their legal rights and citizenship. These laws were a turning point, institutionalizing racial discrimination and setting the stage for the Holocaust. There were two core laws. The Reich Citizenship Law, which declared that only individuals of German or related blood could be citizens. Jews were downgraded to state subjects with no political rights. The Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor, which prohibited marriages and sexual relationships between Jews and non-Jews. These laws defined Jewish identity using racial criteria based on ancestry. Anyone with 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents was classified as Jewish, regardless of their religious beliefs. Because of these laws, Jews were expelled from public service, schools, and professions like law and medicine. Passports of Jewish citizens were stamped with a J, and later, Jews were required to wear a yellow Star of David in public. These laws isolated Jews from society and made their subsequent persecution seem legally justified, leading to mass property seizures, deportations, and ultimately, extermination. Apartheid laws. Apartheid was a system of institutionalized racial segregation that governed South Africa from 1948 to the early 1990s. It was composed of a series of laws that legally separated people by race, with the white minority maintaining dominance over the black majority and other racial groups. Under apartheid, everyone was categorized as either white, black, colored, or Indian. The cornerstone of this system was the Population Registration Act of 1950, which required all South Africans to be racially classified. This was followed by laws like the Group Areas Act, which dictated where each race could reside, leading to the forced relocation of entire communities. Black South Africans were denied citizenship and were instead considered citizens of so-called homelands, which were often poor, underdeveloped regions. Movement was restricted by passed laws that required black citizens to carry identification documents at all times. The Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act and the Immorality Act criminalized interracial relationships. After decades of struggle, led by activists like Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress, and under intense international pressure, apartheid laws were dismantled. In 1994, South Africa held its first multiracial democratic elections, and Nelson Mandela became president. Imperial Japan and comfort women. Between the 1930s and the end of World War II, the Japanese Imperial Army operated a vast system of military-run brothels across its occupied territories. These facilities were known as comfort stations, and the women forced to serve there came to be known as comfort women. Historians estimate that between 50,000 and 200,000 women were coerced into this system. The majority were from Korea, China, and the Philippines, along with other countries across Southeast Asia. Recruitment methods were often deceptive or violent. Some women were tricked with offers of legitimate employment, while others were kidnapped from their homes. Once inside these comfort stations, women were subjected to repeated sexual violence, living in harsh conditions with no personal freedom. The Japanese military justified the creation of these stations as a way to prevent random acts of assault by soldiers and control the spread of STDs. In reality, it was a highly organized system of sexual slavery. After the war, the issue remained largely unspoken for decades until the 1990s, when survivors began to share their stories publicly, bringing international attention to the system's cruelty. Japan has since issued several official apologies and set up the Asian Women's Fund in 1995, though many survivors and human rights organizations feel these efforts have been insufficient. China's one-child policy. In 1980, China officially introduced the one-child policy as a nationwide effort to control the country's rapidly growing population. The policy mostly applied to Han Chinese in urban areas. Enforcement was severe. Couples who had more than one child faced significant financial penalties, loss of employment, and social pressure. Local officials were often under intense pressure to meet birth quotas. The social consequences were profound. This created a significant gender imbalance, with men outnumbering women by an estimated 30 to 40 million. This disparity has caused long-term demographic challenges. Recognizing the unintended consequences of an aging population and shrinking workforce, the government shifted to a two-child policy in 2016, and later, a three-child policy in 2021. Rwandan ethnic cards. In the 1930s, Belgian colonial authorities in Rwanda began issuing identity cards to all Rwandans. These cards categorize citizens by ethnicity Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa based on criteria that often included physical features, social status, or even cattle ownership. This formalized what had previously been more fluid social categories into fixed legal identities. The card soon determined access to education, employment, and government positions. The Tutsis, a minority seen by colonial powers as more elite, were initially favored, deepening resentment among the Hutu majority. After independence in 1962, power shifted to Hutu leadership, who used the same ID system to marginalize and persecute Tutsis. After the genocide, the new Rwandan government removed ethnic labels from all official documents and redesigned the ID card to reflect only national citizenship in a major step toward reconciliation. Pakistan's Blasphemy Laws. Pakistan's blasphemy laws are among the harshest in the world. Originally introduced during British colonial rule, they were significantly expanded during the military regime of General Zia-ul-Haq in the 1980s. These laws criminalize any perceived insult to Islam, the Quran, or the Prophet Muhammad. Under Section 295C of Pakistan's Penal Code, anyone accused of insulting the Prophet faces a mandatory death sentence. The application of these laws has led to widespread controversy. Although the state has never officially executed anyone for blasphemy, more than 85 people have been extrajudicially killed by mobs after being accused, often before their cases could be tried. Religious minorities, including Christians and Hindus, are disproportionately accused. Human rights groups have consistently warned that the laws are vague, open to abuse, and often used to settle personal disputes. Despite global pressure, efforts to reform the laws have been met with fierce resistance from hardline religious groups. From Sparta deciding which infants could live, to Rwanda, where an ID card determined one's right to life, history shows us a frightening truth. The law is a powerful tool. In the hands of a just society, it can be the foundation of freedom and order. But in the hands of tyranny, it becomes the most effective weapon of oppression, legalizing unimaginable cruelty. These examples remind us that legal does not always mean moral, and that the duty of every citizen is not to obey blindly, but to constantly ask, does this law serve justice?